I'm going to now turn to item 7 on the agenda, which is the NHS Performance Report, regular report to the board, and invite Barbara Haken to introduce it.
Thank you, Chairman. This month's report includes a section on the outcomes framework, as well as the standards on which I normally report. What I would like to do as ever, rather than going through the report, which I know board members will have read, is to pick out one or two areas which I want to talk about, some of the issues that we're facing and how we're dealing with them. I'd like to start with referral to treatment, which, as board members know, is the standard for patients who are referred to outpatients and then have diagnostic tests and their treatment. It's the standard for patients who aren't admitted urgently, although notwithstanding that, many patients in that pathway may end up having an urgent condition. And I'd like to remind board members that the standard we now have for those patients is that 92% of them waiting will have waited less than 18 weeks. If you remember, we reduced the number of standards down to that one following on from Bruce's review on the grounds that it was felt that this was better for patients and better to ensure that the longest waiters were treated appropriately. I would also like to make the point that this isn't about waiting 18 weeks to be seen. It is about waiting 18 weeks until you get your definitive treatment, so much like the A&E standard, where we often slip into saying it's 4 hours to be seen. It's not, it's 4 hours to be admitted or discharged. This is about the full treatment. And I also like to make the point that most patients have their definitive treatment much sooner than this, and that the 18 weeks tends to be for those patients, the wait of 18 weeks, or those patients who wait longer, sadly, than 18 weeks, often have very complex conditions and have needed a myriad of diagnostic tests and very careful consideration before their treatment has been eventually decided between the doctor and the patient. For the moment, this standard is being met, and we are continue to work hard and be optimistic that this standard will be met throughout the year. But we have one small cautionary note, and that is that the activity does appear to be rising. So we are seeing a continuing rise in GP and other referrals into the system, which on the first couple of months of data would suggest that the activity may be slightly higher than we've predicted as a need. But I think it's often quite difficult to make assumptions when you've only got 2 or 3 months worth of totally validated activity. So this is something that we will be keeping a very close eye on to ensure that the activity is adequate and that our partners in the trusts have the capacity to do that. A second area that I'd perhaps like to discuss is ambulance standards. Obviously, the time taken for ambulances to reach patients who need them. These standards are very challenging. We've seen some improvement, but the ambulance standards have been challenged for some while. One area which we hope will make a difference and where we'll see improvements is that we have some pilots running at the moment, whereby for those patients not in the very most urgent category, but in the next category down, we have pilots running where the call handlers answering the calls are given slightly longer, only 2 minutes longer, in order to decide whether and how and what ambulance to dispatch to the patient. And the reason for this is that there is evidence that for particularly that category of calls, many ambulances are dispatched very quickly, which are then not needed. And obviously that then has a knock-on effect of that ambulance not then being available for another patient who might need it. So what the pilots are looking at is, number one, to make absolutely sure that for those patients who fit into the category of the ambulance being dispatched slightly more slowly, there's no harm comes to that category of patients if we change the standard. But similarly, that there is benefit to other patients, the wider population, by the ambulances being freed up and released. And those pilots are ongoing at the moment, but the early indications is that what's coming out of that is quite helpful and will prove to be of benefit for patients. A third area that we are worried about and doing a lot of work on with our partners, particularly in the new NHS improvement, so the overseers of the provider trusts, is the standard for cancer, the cancer standard. We meet most of the standards, but the one which we haven't been meeting recently is the 62-day wait. And again, that's the wait that patients have to their definitive treatment. Although no one wants any cancer patient to wait longer than they have to, clearly in some instances the diagnosis and the decision as to what the best treatment is can be quite complicated. I think it's also important to remind everyone that 92% of patients who go into this pathway don't turn out to have cancer. So the pathway is designed to make sure that those patients do have cancer are treated very quickly. But we are seeing a lot of patients who, fortunately on that pathway, do not have cancer and can be discharged. One of the key reasons why we're struggling to meet the standards that have been set, the very high standards that we've set ourselves in England, is that activity has gone up enormously. It's rising by approximately 10% per annum into this pathway, which is higher almost than anything else we see. But that's excellent, because we know the early diagnosis of cancer is one of the reasons, one of the ways in which we can improve survival. And as I've said to the board in the past, a number of the initiatives that we've had helping raise awareness of cancer is part of the reason for this rise. And in fact, there's been a recent campaign for older women with breast cancer, and we're beginning to see a rise in patients coming forward on that basis. That's something that obviously we don't want to do anything about. We want to keep the patients coming forward, so we have to work extra hard to make sure that we've got everything in place in order to make sure that all patients can be seen and treated quickly. And there are some issues, there's some capacity issues, particularly around workforce, making sure that we've got the right trained staff to deal with the growing demand, and sometimes equipment. Some of our equipment is old and needs replacing in order to deal with the numbers and to have the most up-to-date treatments. But one of the things, if you look at what's happening, and what is apparent is that the reason for this standard being missed is the middle portion of the pathway, which is about the time from the outpatient appointment to the diagnosis. So the amount of time the patients wait to see the doctor, the consultant in the first instance, is pretty static, and the amount of time once the diagnosis is made to the definitive start of treatment is fairly static as well. And where we're seeing the rise in this time is for the diagnosis to be made, for the diagnostic tests. And we are particularly seeing a problem with endoscopy, and the graph that you see in the report shows just how many more endoscopies we need to do. An endoscopy is a test whereby you look inside with a light. The two or three that cause us the most problems are the ones where we look down into the stomach, the ones where we look up from the bottom into the colon and rectum, and the ones where we look into the bladder. And we are particularly struggling with increases in those, and particularly gastroscopy and colonoscopy. So whilst we are starting with some long-term solutions as to how we can get the right capacity in place overall, one initiative that we've undertaken recently is to map out all the available capacity to do this endoscopy across England, looking very closely at what's available in the independent sector, but looking at some of our own NHS hospitals who have spare capacity as well. So we now have got a full mapping of all that capacity, which we are sharing and working with all the provider trusts where they are struggling and where it seems that they don't have the right amount of capacity for those patients, so that we can then quickly get those patients transferred. They can have their test quickly and then get the diagnosis. The fourth and final one that I'll mention is access to psychological therapies, where you'll notice that whilst we do very well on access and are broadly meeting the standards that have been set, we're not doing as well in achieving the standards we've set on recovery rates. The latter's clearly the more important one. You can't get the latter without the former. And I think that the difference, to be honest, is the difference in the way that we can deliver these. So in terms of access, it is simply a question of absolutely ensuring that the right number of appointments are available, and I think the NHS has responded really well over the last few months to put those appointments in place for patients. And I think that rapid expansion in the number of appointments has meant that in some instances, some of the services that we're getting don't have quite the good results that others do, and we now therefore need to consolidate, and we need to look across all the services and identify which are the ones that can achieve the best recovery rates, and make sure that those are the services, that those are the quality standards and the hallmarks, the kind marks of actually what we're commissioning. And I think that although it will take slightly longer because it's more complex and it's about winning the kind of making sure the clinical pathways are right, I'm confident that we will see a rise in the recovery rates, because we've got a lot of work. Our clinicians across NHS are doing a lot of work with those areas and those services which are struggling. So, Chairman, I think the rest is if anyone has any questions, either for me on the most of the standards, or for Jane or Bruce if it was the outcomes framework.
Thank you.
Could I ask you one? I think one of the areas that is, I think, very interesting is the views of bereaved carers on the quality of care in the last 3 months of life. I mean, the trouble is you take these aggregated data across the whole system and they don't tell you a great deal about what happens in individual settings. But what notice is taken of those reports that come in that are less than satisfactory? And this is not an indicator that seems to be improving. How do we learn from the data in order to try to improve the offer to those in their last months of life?
Well, maybe I can hand over to Jane on that one, because I say the outcomes framework is the ones that the clinical directorates oversee for us. I'm happy to add if Jane.
I mean, I think it's a really important question. Certainly the care of bereaved people and actually dying is one of our key priorities, and we've just launched some further work on end-of-life care. The patient experience team do spend quite a lot of time concentrating on this particular field. They work with others, other external organisations. We've got very good joint work with people like Macmillan to look at how we can support people both at end of life and their relatives. In terms of individual patient and carer stories, that tends to happen much more at a local level. If we have access to that level of detail, then we can aggregate that and build sort of good case studies and good stories from it. But the networks and the works we're doing at the moment actually is concentrating on that significantly. And I would, while I'm not completely surprised that the figures haven't changed significantly, and it does say very clearly that we need to do more statistical investigation to check whether it is significant. You know, as I've said before on many occasions, one story is one story too many, and you can never go back and say it'll be okay next time. And I think that's something that we need to really emphasise and concentrate on. So carer work and bereaved carers are absolute areas of prioritisation for the experienced team.
No.
You mentioned a few times the word struggling, Barbara, and goodness knows the system is struggling in so many different ways, yet there's one indicator here which is buried, and I think it's interesting to give it more spotlight, and that is this patient experience indicator, which if you were in any other walk of life, you'd look at the patient experience indicator as a serious measure of how well we're doing. And it looks like we're doing really well. And I understand that, you know, there are one or two methodological blips in the way that we handle patient experience data, but why is that? Why is the patient experience coming out consistently strong?
I think it's a difficult question to answer, and I suppose all I can suggest is maybe a personal view. The NHS has consistently, over decades, scored very highly on patient experience compared to private industry, and obviously that's why people look at this and think, gosh, this is marvellous. My only worry about it is that I think particularly the older population, they have less expectation of the NHS. Despite the fact they've paid for it with many years of taxes, there is a degree that it's not a right, that it's something that they should be grateful for the service we deliver them, as opposed to if they go into a shop and buy something. So I think although it's a very high standard here, I think it's something that we need to make sure we're not complacent about, as I say, because patients often aren't as critical of the NHS as they would be of other services they get because of the way they feel about the NHS, and I think that's a bit of a generational thing which we will see change as well. But that's a personal view. They are high figures and we should be very proud of it, and it's testimony to our staff.
Yeah, absolutely. Kieran.
Just following up on that. And the other thing is where staff report good experience at work, patients report good experience at work, and there's an absolutely clear correlation, whether it's in a specific condition like cancer or it's the workforce more broadly as well. So it gets back to this leadership thing.
Good. Jane?
Just very briefly, I completely concur with what Kieran said. And of course, this is one high-level indicator. There are actually a lot more detailed questions that sit underneath this. So we know, for example, that patients have more recently said that they feel they're being treated with compassion. That actually has gone up, which is really encouraging. If you look at GP patient experience, then actually that's even higher. One of the things we could do, if the board thinks it would be useful, is to maybe bring back some further information, some more detail, where we look beneath some of these high-level ones and actually give a bit more explanation about what we're doing together with colleagues throughout the service about where we are. I don't know whether that would be useful.
Yeah, I think that would definitely, because as we know and as we talked about, there's actually huge variation between organisations, between parts of the country, between patient groups, and I mean even just on the GP access one, if you look at the data that I think HSCIC just recently published, I mean, you can see parts of the country where difficulty getting hold of a GP appointment linked to underlying recruitment retention problems, it's all laid out there. And as we talked about previously, big differences between ethnic groups as well. So patients of Pakistani origin, I think 10% less satisfied with the ability to access GP services. So that tells us if we're serious about inequalities reduction, then we've got to target those areas and those groups in new ways.
Sure. Bring it back.
Good. Right. Thank you very much, Barbara, for the paper and for the report.